The first lie you're being fed right now is that loud explosions in Venezuela mean chaos, accident, or some sudden collapse. That's the lazy story. The uncomfortable truth is this: explosions are rarely about destruction alone. They're signals, messages, pressure, and the people who need you confused the most are the ones already positioning themselves to profit from whatever comes next. Some of you will say this is just another failed state imploding. Others will say it's foreign sabotage. Pick a side if you want comfort, but comfort is how you miss the real play. And if you think this story starts with explosions, you're already late. Venezuela is not noisy because it's weak. It's noisy because too many forces are pulling on it at the same time, and something finally snapped. When explosions hit, the first question serious analysts ask is not who did it, but who gains leverage from instability at this exact moment. Timing is everything. And the timing here is surgical. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Not theoretical. Not future tech. Real, heavy crude that still powers militaries, shipping, and industries that green slogans can't replace yet. For years, that oil has been locked behind sanctions, mismanagement, and political paralysis. Now ask yourself why noise suddenly escalates when global energy markets are tight. Sanctions regimes are quietly being renegotiated, and back-channel talks are already happening that the public isn't supposed to notice. Explosions don't just damage infrastructure. They reset negotiations, they change leverage, they create urgency. They allow actors to say, "We warned you stability was fragile," while privately pushing for terms that were impossible to sell yesterday. This is how pressure politics works, not speeches, not tweets. Controlled instability. Inside Venezuela, the regime's biggest fear isn't protesters or bombs, it's irrelevance. When a country becomes ignored, it loses bargaining power. Noise brings attention, attention brings leverage, and leverage brings deals. Whether those explosions were accidental, internal sabotage, or something more deliberate matters less than how they're used afterward. Watch what policies change in the days following. Watch which sanctions get temporarily eased. Watch who suddenly calls for dialogue while moving assets quietly behind the scenes. The media will show you fireballs, sirens, and shaky footage. That's the surface. What they won't show you is the quiet movement of money. The sudden activation of intermediaries, the lawyers and energy executives dusting off old contacts. Because every crisis opens doors that were sealed during calm. And Venezuela has been waiting for a crisis that shifts the balance without triggering full-scale intervention. Now zoom out. The United States doesn't want Venezuela to collapse completely. Chaos creates migration waves, regional instability, and openings for rivals. But Washington also doesn't want Caracas fully independent or defiant. The sweet spot is controlled dysfunction, enough instability to justify influence. Enough survival to keep the oil flowing on negotiated terms. Explosions create plausible deniability for policy shifts. We didn't change strategy, officials will say. Conditions changed. That's how power avoids accountability. Russia and China are watching differently. For them, Venezuela isn't about ideology, it's about footholds, debt leverage, strategic distraction. Every moment the US spends managing instability in its hemisphere is a moment it's not fully focused elsewhere. Loud explosions force attention. They complicate planning. They stretch diplomatic bandwidth. Even if Moscow or Beijing had nothing to do with the blasts, they benefit from the noise. That's the cold logic of geopolitics. You don't need to light the fire to enjoy the smoke. Inside the Venezuelan military, loyalty is transactional, not emotional. Power there is maintained by access to resources, control of smuggling routes, and protection from prosecution. Explosions disrupt those flows. That's dangerous, but it's also useful. Disruption reshuffles internal hierarchies. It creates opportunities to sideline rivals under the banner of security. Crises are perfect moments to consolidate power quietly. The public sees fear, insiders see opportunity. People will argue whether this is a false flag or incompetence. That debate misses the point. In fragile systems, incompetence and strategy often look identical from the outside. Systems hollowed out by corruption don't need enemies to break them. They just need pressure at the right moment. And pressure is exactly what Venezuela is under right now. Economic strangulation, political isolation, and now visible instability. That combination forces choices that leaders would rather avoid. Look at history. Explosions precede negotiations more often than they precede revolutions. They soften resistance, they justify emergency powers. They allow leaders to reframe failure as sabotage. And they give external actors cover to step in reluctantly. This is not new. It's pattern behavior. What's being ignored is the regional angle. Colombia, Brazil, the Caribbean states, they don't want a collapsed Venezuela spilling people and crime across borders. They want predictability. Predictability doesn't require democracy. It requires deals. Explosions threaten predictability, which accelerates regional pressure for a settlement of some kind. That settlement will not look like justice. It will look like compromise dressed up as stability. The US public will be told this is about humanitarian concern. It's not. Humanitarian language is the wrapper, not the product. The product is access, influence, and risk management. Oil licenses will be discussed. Sanctions waivers will be floated. All framed as temporary, conditional, reversible. That's how leverage is preserved while appearing flexible. Now consider the internal population. Ordinary Venezuelans have lived with crisis for so long that explosions don't shock the way outsiders expect. What shocks them is unpredictability. When the state can't guarantee basic security, people stop believing in tomorrow. That's when migration spikes. That's when informal economies explode. That's when criminal networks gain ground. Every blast accelerates that psychological erosion. And that erosion becomes a bargaining chip for both the regime and external actors. Suffering becomes currency. That's the ugliest truth here. If this were truly the beginning of total conflict, you would see different signals. Border mobilizations. Clear factional splits. Capital flight at unprecedented scale. Instead, what you see is noise without escalation. That suggests calibration, not collapse. Someone wants tension without war. Instability without finality. Because finality ends leverage. Pay attention to who calls for calm while preparing contingencies. Pay attention to who condemns violence but quietly reopens channels. That's where the real story is. Not in the explosions themselves, but in the reactions they enable. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Many powerful actors prefer Venezuela permanently unstable rather than resolved. Resolution closes files. Instability keeps options open. As long as the country is almost failing, everyone can justify their involvement. The moment it stabilizes on its own terms, influence shrinks. The second half of this story is where it gets colder. Explosions also test response systems. They reveal weaknesses. How fast do emergency services react? How information flows? How the military coordinates? These are stress tests. In intelligence circles, data gathered during crises is gold. You learn more in one chaotic night than in months of observation. Who panics? Who takes charge? Who disappears? That information reshapes internal power maps. Now think about energy markets. Traders don't care why something explodes. They care about risk premiums. Even rumors of instability move prices. Even temporary disruptions create volatility that someone always profits from. Hedge funds, commodity traders, intermediaries' noise is opportunity. Stability is boring. Instability is profitable if you're positioned correctly. That's why financial interests rarely push hard for true resolution. They thrive in the gray zone. The global narrative will oscillate between outrage and fatigue. First, dramatic headlines. Then silence. That silence is when deals happen. When public attention moves on, that's when the real agreements are signed. Always has been. There's also a domestic U.S. angle no one wants to say out loud. Venezuela is politically useful. It's a symbol, a warning, a talking point. Keeping it in a state of visible dysfunction serves internal narratives about ideology, sanctions, and foreign policy toughness. A resolved Venezuela complicates those narratives. It forces uncomfortable questions about what actually works. So when you hear complete conflict, understand that conflict doesn't always mean bullets and battles. Sometimes it means a permanent state of pressure where no side is allowed to fully win or fully lose. That's the most stable form of instability. And it's exactly where Venezuela has been pushed for years. The explosions are not the story. They are punctuation. They mark a sentence that's been forming for a long time. A sentence written by competing interests, half measures, and calculated neglect. Watch what happens next, not on the streets, but in boardrooms, embassies, and closed-door meetings. Watch the language shift from condemnation to pragmatism. From principles to exceptions, that's how you know the signal was received. And when the noise fades, don't mistake the quiet for peace. Quiet just means the next phase has begun. The phase where outcomes are decided far away from the smoke, by people who never hear the explosions themselves, but who plan for them all along. Do you ever look at the news and feel like it's all just chaos? A random series of events with no rhyme or reason? What if I told you that's not the case? The world isn't a collection of random accidents, it's a chessboard. Every move, every alliance, every conflict. It's all part of a grand strategy. From trade wars to international summits, these are calculated plays in a global game. To truly understand why things are happening, you need to see the board and know the players. That's exactly what we do here. We break down the strategies, analyze the moves, and help you understand the consequences that shape our world. If you want to see behind the headlines and grasp the real game of power, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Global Chessboard and start seeing the world differently. Thanks for watching.